September 9th, 1552, northern Hungary. Captain István Dobo stood atop the eastern wall of Eger Castle, the cold morning wind tugging at his cloak. He pressed a polished brass telescope to his eye, scanning the horizon, eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of the mass moving across the plains. It wasn't clouds gathering, nor a distant storm. The ground itself seemed to darken. It was an army, thousands of men, cavalry at the front, infantry following, endless columns stretching beyond sight. By the heavens, murmured Lieutenant Ferenc Zolt beside him, young, barely 19, clutching the railing as if it could anchor his nerves. How many? Dobo lowered the telescope. His hands were steady, unshaking, though inside his mind the numbers twisted and turned in a soldier's calculus of despair. 2,000 defenders, 40,000 attackers, 20 to 1. The arithmetic was merciless, yet Dobo's voice, calm and measured, carried over the walls. We hold until the last stone, and if they breach us, they pay for every inch. Zolt swallowed, trying not to let fear crack his composure. He had trained alongside Dobo, had watched him command in smaller skirmishes, yet nothing in their experience could have prepared them for this. Captain, do we... He couldn't finish the question. Dobo turned fully, surveying his officers, men whose faces reflected the same dread he knew they all felt. These were not strangers, but comrades forged in the hardships of frontier warfare. Dobo's gaze was steady, carrying authority, conviction, and a warning. We hold, he repeated, quietly, but with absolute certainty. He looked beyond them, at the horizon where armor glinted and standards waved. Somewhere in that metallic tide was Ali Pasha, the Ottoman commander, a man whose reputation for sieges and slaughter was whispered across Europe. Dobo had studied his campaigns, read the grim accounts of cities razed, defenders executed, heads displayed on pikes as warnings, and yet he stood there, unflinching. Send word to every station, Dobo ordered, his voice cutting through the cold wind. Civilians to the inner keep, soldiers to positions, no shots fired until I give the order. Zolt hesitated. Captain, should we attempt negotiation? Dobo's eyes swept the courtyard below, where women and children moved about, preparing for an uncertain day. There is nothing to negotiate, he said. They want this castle. We will not surrender. If they come for it, they will pay dearly for every step they take. Before we dive into the incredible story of Eger, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss any deep historical stories like this. And if you enjoy it, share it with someone who loves history. The castle had been his focus for 3 years. Walls reinforced, stores stocked, training relentless. Now it would be tested by the most formidable military force in the world, 2,000 defenders, a mix of soldiers and civilians, 40,000 attackers, seasoned, disciplined, ruthless. And yet, in Dobo's mind, retreat was unthinkable. He walked along the ramparts, past men inspecting their muskets, past women hauling powder and ammunition, past children too young to grasp the enormity of what was coming. Each step a rehearsal for the moment when survival would demand every ounce of skill, courage, and ingenuity. Dobo paused at the southern bastion, gaze fixed on the horizon, and thought of Ali Pasha, veteran of countless sieges. Reports of the Pasha's methods were horrifying. Entire towns destroyed, defenders tortured, slaves taken, heads displayed. And still Dobo's resolve hardened. All civilians inside, he called down, all soldiers to their stations. No firing until the signal. Zolt looked up, fear in his eyes. Captain, the odds? Ignore the odds, Dobo said. They mean nothing unless we allow them to. The morning sun glinted off the Ottoman armor, thousands of horsemen forming the vanguard, followed by infantry stretching endlessly behind, and then the siege train, immense bronze cannons, each requiring 50 men to move, pulled by oxen, rumbling across the plain like some mechanical nightmare. Dobo lowered the telescope once more, taking in the scale. The calculations returned, but he didn't flinch. 20 to 1, 2,000 against 40,000, and yet in his mind he saw something beyond the arithmetic: determination, training, knowledge, courage. That was the fortress's secret weapon, the one thing the Ottoman army could never anticipate. By late August, the roads leading to Eger Castle were clogged with refugees, families fleeing from villages already touched by the Ottoman advance. Messervest, Karakand, and others arrived with wagons piled high with grain, tools, and whatever belongings they could carry. Children clutched dolls, eyes wide with fear. Old men leaned on walking sticks, faces blank with shock. Smoke from burning homesteads hung on the horizon each day, a grim reminder of what awaited beyond the castle walls. Among the newcomers was Eva Sisi, 34 years old, widow of a cavalry officer lost at Mohacs decades earlier. She had raised her son Mahali alone, running a modest estate outside Messervest. Educated, literate, and stubborn as iron, she refused to flee north when neighbors urged her to seek Habsburg territory. "If I run," she told her son, "where does it stop? How many times do we abandon our homes before deciding to defend them?" She loaded her wagon with supplies and brought her son along, joining the growing column headed to Eger. Also among the refugees was Gurgali Boramisa, 22, a clerk in the service of a minor nobleman. Soft-handed, untrained in combat, nervous, and constantly adjusting his glasses, he had nowhere else to go. His presence would soon become crucial, though he had yet to understand the role he would play. Dobo met the refugees in the castle courtyard, standing tall on a wooden platform. His voice carried over the crowd. "You are safe here. We will feed you, shelter you, and protect you. But understand this. This castle will be besieged. When the Ottomans arrive, no corner will be entirely safe. If you wish to leave, go now. If you stay, you are part of this garrison. Every hand counts." Eva Sisi stepped forward, voice firm despite the dirt on her dress. "We will stay and fight," she declared. Dobo regarded her carefully, noting the steel in her gaze. "Can you load a musket?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. That decision would shape the course of the siege. Dobo set about arming the civilians, training anyone capable of carrying a weapon. Children and the elderly were assigned support roles, carrying water, tending the wounded, but able-bodied men and women were taught to load muskets, handle spears, and defend the walls if the worst occurred. Women organized into crews to prepare food, manage supplies, and tend to the injured. Others, like Eva Sisi, trained to directly combat attackers if the walls were breached. At first, Dobo hesitated. He knew the horrors that awaited civilians in fallen cities. He had seen reports, heard stories, yet Ava's defiance left no room for doubt. "We know the risks, Captain," she said. "We would rather die defending our home than await capture." Dobo nodded slowly. "Report to the armory at dawn. We will begin training immediately. Over the next 2 weeks, Eger transformed into a fortress, readying itself for a trial by fire. Civilians learned to load and fire muskets, haul cauldrons of boiling water to the walls, and recognize the subtle signs of mining beneath the foundations. Gurgali Boramisa volunteered for the grueling labor of digging defensive trenches, hands blistered and bleeding, yet he persisted without complaint. Children ferried stones to reinforce the walls, brought ammunition, and assisted wherever the garrison needed them. The elderly sharpened blades, prepared bandages, and kept the kitchens running. Every individual became part of a single organism, the castle itself. Dobo patrolled the walls each evening, observing the tireless activity. He watched Eva Sisi practice her musket, jaw clenched in concentration. He saw Boramisa struggling under baskets of rubble, refusing aid. Soldiers drilled farmers in formations, spear techniques, and the trust needed to survive the coming storm. And for the first time in years, Dobo felt a flicker of hope, not that they would emerge unscathed, but that these people would not surrender quietly. On September 8th, 1552, the last refugee columns arrived and the gates were sealed. Watchtowers reported movement on the southern horizon. Dobo stood on the eastern wall, staring at the empty plains beyond, waiting, knowing that by morning the horizon would blacken with the approaching army. The Ottoman army approaches. September 9th, 1552, northern Hungary. The morning sun glinted off the eastern walls of Eger Castle, but Captain István Dobo barely noticed. He had a brass telescope pressed to his eye, tracing the horizon that was beginning to darken. At first he thought it might be storm clouds, but the black on the plain was not weather, it was men. Thousands of horsemen moving in perfect, disciplined formation caught the sunlight on polished armor and glimmering blades. The vanguard surged forward, a river of steel and leather, the cadence of hooves announcing the approaching storm. Behind them, infantry columns stretched endlessly back, a moving wall of banners and weapons. At the rear, massive bronze cannons were hauled by teams of oxen, each gun requiring dozens of men to maneuver. Dobo lowered his telescope and allowed himself a brief, steadying breath. His hands remained calm, but his mind ran through calculations he had practiced hundreds of times over 3 years. 2,000 defenders in the castle walls, 40,000 men advancing to destroy them, 20 to 1. A voice broke his concentration. Lieutenant Ferenc Zsolt, 19, fresh-faced and trying hard to sound composed, spoke from behind him. "Captain, what do we do?" Dobo turned, eyes scanning the men he trusted, officers trained and tested under his command. They looked at him as drowning men look at a lifeline. He breathed in slowly, weighing the odds. "We hold," he said quietly, almost to himself. "We hold until there is nothing left to hold with, and if they break through, we make them pay for every inch." Even as the weight of the moment settled, Dobo remembered the human element, the refugees who had poured into Edgar over the past weeks, families who had nowhere else to go. He considered Eva Sisi and her son, Gergali Boromisa, and the dozens of women and men now armed and trained under his direction. Their courage and determination would matter, perhaps more than the stone walls or the cannons. The fortress now stood as the last bastion of independent Hungary in this sector. Only 800 soldiers, 200 civilians, and a handful of officers would oppose one of the most advanced military machines in the world. The castle had 3 months of carefully rationed food, 42 cannons, many cracked or outdated, and walls that had not been tested in a real siege for over a generation, yet they had something far more formidable than stone or steel, a commander who had spent years preparing for a moment exactly like this. Dobo walked along the walls, past soldiers checking muskets, past women hauling ammunition, past children too young to understand the full scale of what was coming. He reached the southern bastion, eyes fixed on the approaching mass of cavalry and infantry. Somewhere in that river of steel was Ali Pasha, a veteran Ottoman commander who had never failed to take a fortress. Dobo knew of the horrors Ali Pasha left in his wake. Cities razed, heads mounted on pikes, entire populations enslaved. And yet, Dobo stood his ground. "Send word to every station," he ordered. "Civilians to the inner keep, soldiers to positions. No one fires until I give the order." Zsolt, still hesitant, ventured a question. "Should we try to negotiate?" Dobo studied him. "There is nothing to negotiate. They want this castle. We will not give it to them. We will teach them what it costs to take something from Hungarians." His boots echoed against centuries-old stone as he moved toward the command tower. In 6 weeks, that stone would be soaked in blood. In 6 weeks, Edgar Castle would be etched into history. But on this morning, Dobo's mission was clear: watch, calculate, and prepare for the storm to break. From the edge of cannon range, the Ottoman army halted, 40,000 men waiting, 2,000 defenders refusing to yield. The siege was about to begin. To understand the full scale of the threat, one must understand the Ottoman Empire by 1552. It was no ragtag coalition. It was the most sophisticated military force on earth, an empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to Vienna, from Arabia to the Danube. At its helm, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent had spent 32 years conquering relentlessly Belgrade, Rhodes, Mohacs. The list was endless. Eger on the frontier represented the next challenge, and failure here could open a path north to the heart of Europe. By September 12, 1552, the Ottoman army had completed its initial encirclement of Eger Castle. The sun rose over the horizon to reveal tents stretching across the plain like a sea of canvas. Soldiers moved with precision, engineers measuring angles for cannon placements, teams hauling heavy artillery into position. Each bronze gun gleamed under the early light, ready to punish the ancient stone walls that had stood for centuries. The air smelled of smoke, horse sweat, and the tang of sharpened steel. Dust from the march still clung to every surface. From the eastern wall, Captain István Dobo surveyed the approaching menace. He knew the Ottomans were not merely relying on numbers. Their tactics were deliberate, methodical, and merciless. Each step they took had been planned months before, each action rehearsed, each weapon maintained to perfection. Dobo turned to his officers, faces drawn with tension, young and old, men who had chosen to remain despite the overwhelming odds. "They will fire first at our walls, testing them," he said quietly. "We respond with every cannon, every musket, every stone we can lift. We do not flinch. We do not retreat. We hold, and we make them pay for every inch." Below the walls, the civilians moved with purpose. Women carried water in buckets, filling vats to pour upon attackers, while older men assisted the wounded and reinforced barricades. Children were sent to transport stones and ammunition, their small arms steady under the supervision of soldiers. Even the hesitant among them found courage in the urgency of the moment. Among the refugees was Eva Sisi, standing tall despite the grime of travel and fatigue. She supervised a small team of women learning to fire muskets and defend the walls. Her eyes met Dobo's from across the courtyard, a silent pledge of resolve passing between them. Soldiers continued drills, their movements sharp, precise, as if the coming battle were already choreographed. Dobo watched closely, noting weaknesses, adjusting positions, preparing for the first contact. Every observation mattered. Every command could mean the difference between survival and slaughter. As the sun climbed, distant shadows began to coalesce on the horizon. The Ottoman cavalry tested the limits of their encirclement, scouting, probing, and attempting to intimidate. Their banners fluttered like waves, the sound of hooves pounding against the earth, echoing across the valley. Dobo raised his telescope, scanning the mass of men. He counted what he could, estimated the rest. The numbers confirmed the arithmetic of fear: 40,000 men poised to destroy 2,000 defenders. Yet, as he lowered the telescope, he felt the weight of preparation, of every drill, every reinforcement, every day spent readying Edgar for this moment. He was not naive about the cost, but he understood one truth more than anything. The defenders had something the Ottomans did not. They were fighting for home, for family, for the memory of lands burned, and for the people who had nowhere else to run. That was a force no army could quantify, a determination no cannon could break. The day wore on with an eerie calm. The Ottomans set their siege guns, carefully calculating distances, while the garrison repaired minor damage from earlier skirmishes. Civilians continued to work tirelessly, following orders, learning skills in mere days that might save their lives. By nightfall, the outer edges of the Ottoman lines were lit by small fires, signal beacons, and the scattered torches of sentries. Dobo walked the ramparts, speaking softly to his men, checking positions, ensuring every corner was prepared. He moved past the women and older boys, nodding in silent approval as they carried water, reinforced walls, and sharpened blades. In that quiet night, with the distant campfires glimmering and the sound of animals and men settling, Dobo allowed himself a moment of reflection. They would be tested like no one in living memory, but Edgar would not fall without a fight that would echo for generations. Tomorrow, the siege would truly begin. September 13th, 1552, dawn arrived with a quiet that belied the violence to come. From the walls of Edgar Castle, Captain István Dobo could see the Ottoman army in motion. Thousands of soldiers, rows of cavalry, and the siege train stretching across the plain like a dark river of iron and canvas. The vanguard had positioned themselves for reconnaissance, probing the outer defenses with careful precision. Each move was calculated, each shift of a cannon or soldier tested the reaction of the garrison. Dobo observed the men, noting formations, predicting possible attacks. He turned to his officers. Today they test our resolve. Every shot fired, every man lost. We will respond. We are the wall between them and our homes. Every stone we hold, every life we save, is a victory. Do not underestimate them. Do not fear them. We fight as one. Beneath the battlements, the castle had become a hive of activity. Women carried pails of water to the ramparts, while men reinforced barricades and checked the ammunition. Children moved with careful hands, lifting stones, transporting powder, and watching the soldiers as they drilled in preparation for the inevitable assault. Eva Sisi moved among them, her voice steady, giving orders and encouragement. She had trained tirelessly with the women, teaching them to fire muskets, handle crossbows, and recognize signs of tunneling or siege engines approaching. Each woman and man knew their role, knew the risks, and accepted them. The Ottoman artillery opened fire just before mid-morning. The first cannonballs screamed through the air, striking the outer walls of Edgar with tremendous force. Each impact shook the stone, sending dust and pebbles into the air, echoing through the courtyard. Soldiers braced themselves, firing back with every cannon and musket at their disposal. The sound was deafening, a continuous roar punctuated by the occasional crack of splintering stone. Civilians pressed against the walls, some wincing at the shock waves, others gripping their tools and weapons, ready to act. Dobo moved along the ramparts, shouting orders, repositioning men, and ensuring that every cannon was loaded and every musket aimed. The outer wall shook, but the reinforcements of timber and earth absorbed much of the force, preventing catastrophic breaches. By afternoon, the bombardment had intensified. Ottoman engineers were at work, setting up saps and attempting to dig under the walls. Hungarian observers, stationed in hidden positions along the interior of the castle, watched for the telltale vibrations in water bowls placed on the floors of the towers. Any ripple meant a tunnel was being dug beneath them. Dobo dispatched small teams of counterminers, men and volunteers who knew the risks, but understood the necessity. The work was grueling. Confined in narrow tunnels, the air thick and heavy, men dug through earth and stone, listening for the faint sounds of enemy activity. When they encountered Ottoman miners, fighting broke out in the suffocating darkness. Daggers and picks became the only means of survival, and every encounter was a test of courage and endurance. At the walls, the defenders faced another type of assault. Janissaries advanced in disciplined lines, scaling ladders toward the battlements. Cannon and musket fire met them, but the attackers persisted, knowing that casualties were expected. Civilians joined the fight directly. Women, trained and organized by Eva Sisi, poured boiling water, oil, and other scalding liquids onto the advancing soldiers. The effect was immediate and devastating. Men dropped their weapons, screamed, and retreated, or fell to the ground, often blinded or severely burned. The defenders had prepared for this. Water had been heated, cauldrons moved into position, and everyone trained to act under fire. The assault lasted hours, waves of attackers, repeatedly striking the walls, only to be repelled. By nightfall, hundreds of Ottoman soldiers lay dead or wounded at the base of the castle. As darkness fell, Captain Dobo walked the walls. He spoke quietly to his men, checking on the wounded, encouraging the tired, and assessing the damage. The bombardment had not stopped, and the threat of mining remained. Food and ammunition were rationed carefully. Civilians and soldiers alike understood the stakes. The siege was no longer a test of strength alone. It was a trial of endurance, discipline, and the will to survive. Yet even in the face of overwhelming numbers, Edgar Castle held. The walls stood, the defenders remained resolute, and the Ottomans had been forced to reconsider their strategy. Dobo looked across the battlefield, counting every cannon, every tent, every signal fire, knowing that tomorrow would demand the same courage and tenacity. September 14th, 1552. The castle stirred before sunrise. Smoke still rose from the horizon where villages had been razed, a constant reminder of the Ottoman advance. Captain István Dobo climbed the eastern wall, telescope in hand, scanning the plain. The siege lines had shifted overnight. Siege towers, wooden and towering, had been rolled into position under the cover of darkness. Engineers worked furiously to prepare for a fresh assault, and the Janissaries were assembling once again, their disciplined formations reflecting in the morning sun. Every movement was deliberate, every arrangement intended to break the spirit of Edgar's defenders. Inside the castle, life had adapted to the rhythm of the siege. The sound of cannon fire had become a constant backdrop, a drum beat that measured days and nights. Civilians moved with purpose, carrying water, repairing walls, and tending to the wounded. Eva Chisi oversaw the distribution of weapons to able-bodied men and women, ensuring everyone knew their role. She moved through the courtyard with calm authority, teaching villagers how to load muskets, how to position themselves along the walls, and how to support the soldiers without exposing themselves unnecessarily. Her presence brought a measure of reassurance. By mid-morning, the first volleys of the day were exchanged. Ottoman cannons fired relentlessly, while Edgar's defenders returned fire, aiming at the massed infantry and siege engines. The projectiles tore through the earth and stone, creating clouds of dust that limited visibility but did little to deter either side. Soldiers shouted instructions over the roar, repositioned cannons, and repaired damaged sections of the walls. Every action was a delicate balance between aggression and caution. Civilians assisted where they could, carrying supplies up the walls, watching for the telltale signs of tunneling, and preparing scalding liquids for potential assaults. In the south courtyard, young Gergali Boromissa labored with the countermining teams. Hands raw and blistered, he dug through dense earth with picks and shovels. The tunnel was narrow, the air thick and hot. Every scrape of rock or soil brought tension, every sound amplified in the confined space. When vibrations appeared in the water bowls above, signaling an Ottoman tunnel, the team worked silently but urgently. They broke through the enemy mine, collapsing it with a small explosive charge, shaking the castle and leaving the enemy temporarily stunned. Emerging, covered in mud and sweat, Boromissa took a moment to breathe, knowing that this was just one of many such encounters that would come in the days ahead. On the walls, the Janissaries were preparing for another direct assault. Scaling ladders were set against the battlements, shields and weapons ready. Hungarian defenders, led by Dobo, awaited them. The women, under Eva Sisi's instruction, carried cauldrons of boiling water and oil, prepared to pour it onto any soldier who attempted to climb the walls. When the assault began, the defenders unleashed a coordinated barrage of cannon, musket, and crossbow fire. The first wave of attackers fell in droves, but the Janissaries advanced relentlessly, understanding that success came at the cost of many lives. Ladders toppled, bodies fell, screams filled the air, but the walls held. By midday, the courtyard and the base of the walls were littered with Ottoman dead and wounded. The defenders had sustained casualties as well, but the ratio was in their favor due to preparation, tactics, and the determination of the civilian fighters. Captain Dobo moved along the battlements, checking every cannon, speaking to soldiers and civilians alike, encouraging them, and ensuring that defenses remained intact. The assault ended with the Janissaries retreating in order, leaving the battlefield strewn with the evidence of their failure. As evening fell, the castle's occupants tended to the wounded and repaired damages. The strain was visible on every face, but morale remained steady. Captain Dobo addressed his officers in the command tower. "We have held today, but this is far from over. Tomorrow they will adapt. We must be ready. Every stone, every barrel of powder, every person here is a weapon. We will use them all." The officers nodded. Each understood the gravity of the siege, yet each shared the resolve of their captain. Edgar Castle had survived another day, but the shadow of the Ottoman Empire stretched endlessly across the plains, promising further trials. September 15th, 1552, the first light revealed the toll the previous day had taken on both sides. Cannon smoke still lingered over the plain, mingling with the morning mist. Captain István Dóbo walked the walls of Edgar Castle, observing the damage. Stones had been displaced, sections of the outer parapets cracked, and the ground littered with spent cannonballs and the remnants of siege towers. The defenders were exhausted but resolute, their movements precise despite fatigue. Civilians carried out repairs, hauled water, and tended the wounded with quiet efficiency. Inside the inner keep, Eva Sisi and other civilian leaders organized small groups to bolster defenses. They drilled men and women in musket handling, ladder defense, and the use of boiling liquids against attackers. The children, under careful supervision, carried stones and ammunition to the walls, their small hands surprisingly strong for the task. Even the elderly contributed, sharpening blades, preparing bandages, and maintaining the kitchens that fed the garrison. Every person in Edgar Castle had a role, and every role mattered. By mid-morning, Ottoman scouts were spotted at the horizon. Ali Pasha's forces had repositioned their artillery, moving the heaviest bronze cannons closer to the walls while keeping them just beyond the effective range of Edgar's lighter guns. The sound of distant drums signaled a forthcoming attack, the rhythm echoing across the plains like a warning. Captain Dobo stood on the eastern wall, telescope in hand, calculating the timing, range, and trajectory of the approaching assault. Orders were shouted, soldiers took their positions, and the civilians prepared for the inevitable clash. When the attack commenced, the defenders unleashed a coordinated response. Cannons fired grape shot and heavy stone balls, while muskets and crossbows targeted the advancing infantry. The Janissaries moved with precision, undeterred by the casualties falling before them. They advanced in disciplined formations, their drums a constant reminder of order and inevitability. Ladders were raised against the walls, and soldiers began their climb under a storm of fire. Women stationed along the walls poured boiling water and oil onto anyone who reached the base of the ladders, turning ordinary defensive tactics into a terrifying experience for the attackers. The effect was devastating. Soldiers screamed, stumbled, and in many cases fell back down the ladders, leaving their comrades exposed. Captain Dobo moved along the battlements, coordinating defenses, encouraging civilians, and ensuring that no part of the wall was left undefended. Despite repeated attempts, the Ottoman forces were repulsed. Hundreds of dead and wounded littered the base of the walls, while the defenders sustained losses but remained operational. By mid-afternoon, the attackers fell back to regroup, and the castle's occupants took the time to tend their wounded, reinforce damaged sections, and prepare for the next wave. The siege had become a battle of attrition, each day bringing new assaults, more cannon fire, and the constant strain of defending against overwhelming numbers. As dust settled, Captain Dobo gathered his officers in the command tower. He spoke quietly but firmly, outlining the lessons of the day. They will not relent, they will adapt as they always do. We must anticipate, we must prepare, and we must endure. Every barrel of powder, every stone, every person here is part of our strength. Use them wisely, and we will continue to survive. The officers nodded, fully aware that each day was a test of endurance, courage, and strategy. That night, fires were lit throughout Edgar Castle, as civilians and soldiers alike worked to repair walls, replenish ammunition, and tend the wounded. The castle had survived another day, but the shadow of the Ottoman Empire loomed larger with each passing hour. Captain Dobo remained on the walls long into the night, telescope at his side, eyes scanning the horizon. He knew the coming days would bring new challenges, and that every decision, every action, could mean the difference between survival and destruction. September 16th, 1552. Dawn broke with a muted light, and the sound of Ottoman drums began once more. This time the assault was larger and more coordinated. Thousands of janissaries formed up outside the walls, organized into multiple columns. Each column carried scaling ladders, long wooden beams designed to hook over the battlements. Their padded tunics and light armor allowed for speed, while small round shields protected vital areas. Scimitars, daggers, and matchlock muskets completed their arsenal. Captain István Dobo watched from the eastern wall, hand resting on the cold stone, eyes scanning every formation, every movement. Hold your fire until they are within 50 yards, he ordered. The soldiers obeyed, muscles tense, nerves taut, every hand gripping a weapon. The first wave of attackers advanced with relentless precision. No war cries, no shouting, just disciplined movement, each step calculated to bring them closer to the walls. When the janissaries reached the critical distance, the defenders unleashed their prepared defenses. Cannons fired grape shot, scattering iron balls like a lethal hailstorm across the attackers' ranks. Muskets cracked in controlled volleys. Crossbows loosed bolts that struck with deadly accuracy. The initial wave faltered, many soldiers falling under the storm of metal and fire. Yet the lines behind them pressed forward, undeterred by the carnage at the front. Ladders slammed against the stone walls, dozens at a time. Soldiers climbed, met immediately by Hungarian defenders, thrusting spears, swinging axes, and pushing ladders backward into the mass of attackers. The fight was merciless, chaotic, and brutal. Bodies piled at the base of the walls, some crushed by falling ladders, some trampled by the advancing waves. Women played an extraordinary role in the defense. Eva Sheethy and other civilian leaders orchestrated teams that hauled cauldrons of boiling water, oil, and rendered fat to the walls. When Ottoman soldiers clustered at the base of ladders, the women poured the scalding liquids down on them. Men screamed, dropped weapons, stumbled backward, blinded or burned. The effect was devastating, leaving attackers incapacitated or dead, while reinforcing the defenders' morale. Captain Dobo moved from bastion to bastion, coordinating counterattacks, ensuring civilians and soldiers alike knew their positions and responsibilities. Every section of the wall had been reinforced, every weak point addressed. Soldiers were rotated frequently. Civilians kept moving to avoid exhaustion. Despite the ferocity of the assault, the walls held. Hundreds of attackers lay dead or wounded, yet more continued to climb, driven by discipline and the expectation of success. The attack lasted approximately 4 hours, each wave meeting the same deadly resistance. By mid-morning, Ali Pasha called off the assault, the janissaries retreating in good order, carrying the wounded and leaving many dead behind. Inside the castle, the defenders took stock. 47 soldiers had fallen, 80 wounded. For a garrison of 800, these losses were significant, but not crippling. Captain Dobo addressed his officers quietly that evening. Today we learned they can be stopped. Tomorrow we prove we can do it again. Ali Pasha, observing the results, was already adapting his strategy. If scaling the walls failed, he would attempt undermining them. Mining was the next tactic. Ottoman engineers selected sections of the walls and began digging tunnels from positions beyond musket range. Timber beams supported the shafts, while the miners worked meticulously toward the foundations of the walls. Once beneath, chambers were packed with gunpowder, fuses lit, and the tunnels abandoned to detonate, intended to collapse sections of the fortifications. Captain Dobo, anticipating this, employed water-filled bowls on the floors inside the castle to detect vibrations from digging. Ripples revealed the location of enemy tunnels, allowing countermining teams to dig toward the Ottomans, collapse their tunnels, or engage miners directly. The work was claustrophobic and terrifying. Small teams, sometimes no more than 6 men, labored in near total darkness with oil lamps, consuming precious oxygen. By September 24th, Gergali Boramissa and his team broke into an Ottoman tunnel. What followed was close quarters combat in conditions almost impossible to imagine. Narrow spaces left no room to swing swords. Men fought with daggers, picks, and their hands. Dust filled the air, and the screams echoed in the darkness. One lamp fell and extinguished, leaving the combatants in near blackness. Boramissa stabbed an enemy soldier he could not see, checking only when the body went limp. Eventually, the Hungarian counterminers sealed the tunnel with rubble and a small explosive charge. The blast shook the castle, but left the eastern bastion standing. Eva Sisi, supervising the civilians, found Boramissa sitting in mud and blood, temporarily deaf and shaking. She offered water, sitting quietly with him, the silence speaking louder than words. Over the next 2 weeks, Ottoman engineers attempted 4 more mining operations, each detected and neutralized by Hungarian counterminers. Despite these successes, the strain on the defenders was mounting. Gunpowder dwindled, food rations were reduced, and casualties continued to rise. Yet the garrison's resolve remained unbroken. By early October, the siege had settled into a grueling rhythm. The bombardment never ceased. Day and night, the Ottoman cannons thundered, hurling massive stone balls that shook the walls of Eger Castle. Dust and debris filled the air, making every breath a struggle. Defenders worked tirelessly to repair damage, hauling stones, packing earth behind shattered masonry, and reinforcing weakened sections. Every hour brought new casualties, every cannonball a reminder that the fortress could not hold forever. The civilian population, trained by Dobo, was fully engaged. Women carried ammunition, water, and oil, ready to pour boiling liquids on attackers at a moment's notice. Children moved supplies along the walls, their small hands gripping stones and sandbags. Even the elderly contributed, sharpening weapons, tending the wounded, and managing the kitchens to ensure soldiers and families alike did not starve. Every person inside Edgar was essential to survival. The castle had become a living organism, every action feeding into the defense. Ali Pasha, growing frustrated at the resistance, prepared for another assault. On October 3rd, nearly 15,000 Ottoman soldiers were deployed simultaneously along multiple sections of the wall. The attack was designed to overwhelm the defenders, spreading them thin and forcing gaps to appear. Drums and bugles signaled the advance. Columns of janissaries moved with disciplined precision, each step measured, each formation perfect. Their training, endurance, and ruthlessness made them terrifying opponents. Dobo surveyed the approaching columns, noting the scale of the threat. He gave calm, precise orders. Do not fire until they reach the marked distance. Hold your ground. Protect the walls. Every life counts. Cannons roared, muskets cracked, and crossbows twanged as the first waves collided with the defensive positions. Yet the janissaries advanced relentlessly. knowing losses were expected, but that their numbers would eventually allow them to breach the walls. The defenders met them with every resource at their disposal. Cannons loaded with grape shot tore into the attackers, musket volleys erupted in succession, and women poured scalding liquids on those who reached the walls. The fight was brutal and personal. Every swing of a weapon, every drop of boiling water, every shove on a ladder, potentially life or death. Waves of attackers fell, but more kept coming. For hours, the battle raged, echoing across the plains of northern Hungary. While the assault pressed on, Ottoman engineers continued their mining operations. Dobo's countermining teams were stretched thin. They worked day and night, often with only a few hours of rest between detecting enemy tunnels and sealing them. The confined spaces, darkness, dust, and heat made every moment harrowing. Small teams of 4 to 6 men dug tirelessly toward enemy shafts, listening intently for the faintest vibration. When they broke into Ottoman tunnels, combat ensued immediately. There was no room to retreat, no room to swing a sword fully. Hand-to-hand fighting with picks, daggers, and sheer strength became the only option. One such countermine operation, led by Gergali Boromissa, became legendary in the chronicles of the siege. As the Hungarian miners broke into an Ottoman tunnel, they were met with desperate resistance. Screams echoed, dust filled every inch of air, and the faint light of a single lamp flickered in the chaos. Boromissa struck an enemy soldier blindly, feeling the body slump before continuing, ensuring the tunnel could be collapsed to prevent further undermining. The resulting explosion rocked the eastern bastion but left it standing. Mud, blood, and exhaustion coated the miners, yet morale remained intact. By mid-October, the siege had taken its toll. Gunpowder reserves dwindled, food rations were reduced to near starvation levels, and wounded filled the chapel, transformed into a makeshift hospital. The defenders' strength was being tested physically and mentally, yet Captain Dobo's leadership, the training of civilians, and the fortress's preparation had kept the Ottomans from breaching the walls. Each failed assault and neutralized tunnel was proof that determination, planning, and collective effort could resist even the most powerful army in the world. The Siege of Eger was no longer just a military struggle, it had become a symbol of resistance. The fortress, defended by 800 soldiers and 2,200 civilians, stood against an army of 40,000. Ali Pasha's frustrations grew daily as Dobo and his defenders countered every tactic, adapted to each assault, and turned desperation into organized defense. The Ottoman commander realized that sheer numbers alone would not take the castle. Discipline, innovation, and courage had created a stalwart opposition that refused to yield. By early October, the siege had settled into a relentless rhythm. The defenders at Eger moved like shadows across the walls, repairing breaches, hauling ammunition, tending the wounded, and keeping watch over every vulnerable point. The Ottomans maintained their bombardment without pause, firing hundreds of rounds each day. The sound was a constant roar, punctuated by the crashing of stones against walls and the screams of men struck by flying debris. Dust choked the courtyards, and smoke from small fires turned the air thick and gray. Every corner of the castle had been pressed into service. Barracks held the soldiers, kitchens prepared meager rations, and the chapel had been transformed into a hospital. The wounded lay on straw mats, attended by women whose hands were raw and bloody, their prayers mixing with curses at the enemy. Gergali Boromissa and others carried out repairs under fire, reinforcing walls with earth and timber, patching holes left by cannonballs. Each impact reminded them that every second counted, that each failed repair could mean death. On October 3rd, Ali Pasha committed nearly 15,000 men to attack multiple sections of the wall at once. The defenders braced, matchlocks ready, boiling water cauldrons on the parapets, crossbows strung tight. The Ottoman columns advanced with terrifying precision, ladders raised and shields held high. They moved like a living wave, silent except for the steady beat of drums. When they reached the walls, they were met with fire, grape shot, arrows, and the scalding heat of water. The first wave faltered, but more pressed forward, trained to accept casualties. The defenders held, repelling one wave after another. Soldiers, farmers, and women fought side by side, each person a vital cog in the defense. The ground below the walls was littered with bodies, yet the attackers kept climbing, undeterred. As the day dragged on, exhaustion set in. Soldiers' arms burned from pulling ropes, hauling stones, and firing their weapons. Women carried heavy cauldrons and ran along slippery parapets. Children assigned to safer tasks shuttled ammunition, moving as quickly as fear and fatigue allowed. By mid-morning, the walls remained unbroken, the defenders bloodied, but still standing. Istvan Dobo moved among them, checking on wounds, shouting encouragement, adjusting positions, ensuring every musket was loaded, and every man and woman knew their place. In those hours, he observed a truth that would remain with him. Courage was contagious, and desperation forged bonds stronger than fear. Ali Pasha, meanwhile, watched from a distance. His patience was immense, his strategy calculated. Direct assault had failed, but he knew the fortress could be overcome. The Ottomans began preparing for mining operations once again. Engineers gathered, digging toward the walls in secret, their progress masked by the continuing bombardment. Each tunnel was a threat, a hidden weapon, designed to collapse a section of wall and allow the Janissaries to pour in. Dobo had anticipated this, and his countermining teams were ready. Gergali Boramisa and a small team of miners descended into the tunnels beneath the eastern bastion. They worked in darkness, hands blistered and lungs burning, listening for the enemy's faint hammering. The air was thick and hot, the walls slick with sweat. Every sound could signal imminent danger. When they finally broke into an Ottoman tunnel, combat erupted in near total darkness. Men stabbed blindly, grappled in tight confines, and fought with a ferocity born of fear. Minutes felt like hours as bodies collided, dust and smoke filled the air, and every movement was a gamble with death. The Hungarians emerged victorious from the tunnel, collapsing it behind them with barrels of rubble. The walls still stood, and the castle survived another day. By mid-October, supplies were dangerously low. Food rations had been reduced further, gunpowder was almost spent, and casualties continued to mount, yet morale held. The defenders understood the arithmetic of survival. Every repelled attack was proof that the Ottomans could be stopped, that courage and preparation could hold even against impossible odds. Each day Dobo walked the walls, speaking quietly to his soldiers, women, and civilians. He reminded them that their efforts mattered, that they were part of a machine that refused to break. As October progressed, the Ottomans intensified their efforts. Ali Pasha coordinated a series of simultaneous attacks combining artillery, infantry, and mining operations. Every day, the fortress endured relentless cannon fire, sending plumes of dust and stone into the sky. Sections of the walls cracked and towers shuddered under repeated impacts. Hungarian defenders moved with practiced efficiency, reinforcing weakened points, hauling rubble, and firing back whenever possible. The sound was deafening. Cannon booms, the clash of weapons, screams of the wounded, and the rhythmic beat of drums from the Ottoman camp. Women played an increasingly active role in the defense. They hauled cauldrons of boiling water, poured boiling oil, and flung stones down on the attackers. Civilians, trained by Dobo, carried ammunition, repaired walls, and tended to the wounded. Every person capable of contributing had a task. Soldiers and militia worked in coordination with the civilians, creating a defense that was greater than the sum of its parts. Gergali Boramisa, once nervous and untested, now moved confidently among the walls. directing teams and assisting with countermining operations. Each day hardened the defenders, transforming fear into resolve. The Ottomans persisted. Mining continued under cover of night, their engineers tunneling beneath walls to plant barrels of gunpowder. Dobo's counterminers listened intently, using bowls of water and other detection techniques to locate enemy tunnels. The work was claustrophobic and exhausting, with every false move risking death. When a tunnel was discovered, small teams would enter, collapse it, or engage in brutal close quarters combat. The defenders learned to fight in darkness, to improvise with tools at hand, and to survive by instinct. By mid-October, casualties had begun to mount on both sides. Hungarian defenders had lost dozens of men, but the Ottomans were suffering far heavier losses. The fortress was holding, and the defenders' resolve was visible in every action. Even as supplies dwindled, their coordination improved. Every day brought new challenges: repair walls under fire, repel assaults, extinguish fires, and maintain vigilance. Exhaustion was constant, but it never broke their spirit. Ali Pasha adapted. When direct assaults failed, he relied more on artillery bombardment, combined with flanking operations and psychological pressure. The Ottomans tried to intimidate the defenders by displaying severed heads from earlier campaigns, sending messages of inevitable defeat, and staging feigned retreats. Dobo's garrison remained unshaken, the walls held, and the defenders continued to fight as a single entity. Civilians carried out their roles with precision, and women, under the leadership of Eva Sisi and others, became active participants in the defense, responding to breaches, manning parapets, and assisting in countermining. By late October, it was clear that the siege had become a war of attrition. The defenders had slowed the Ottoman advance and forced them into repeated costly attacks. Each day was a struggle, each night a tense vigil. Soldiers and civilians alike had become skilled in every aspect of siege warfare. The castle was battered but unbroken. Every cannonball that struck the walls, every assault repelled, reinforced a lesson. Determination and preparation could overcome overwhelming odds. By the end of October, Eger Castle showed the scars of constant bombardment. Walls were chipped, towers leaned slightly from repeated impacts, and debris littered the courtyards. Yet inside, the defenders had grown resilient. Soldiers moved with purpose. Civilians carried out their duties efficiently, and women continued to play a critical role in defense. Each person understood the stakes. Every cannonball that struck the walls, every soldier that fell, every shattering noise of masonry hitting the ground reminded them of what they were fighting for: their homes, their families, and their survival. The Ottomans, frustrated by repeated failures, intensified psychological pressure. They taunted the defenders, hung effigies of Hungarian soldiers, and staged mock executions of prisoners captured elsewhere. Messages were sent, warning that resistance was futile and that surrender would spare lives. Dobo, unflinching, responded with silence and action. He reinforced positions, trained civilians, and maintained morale. The garrison, though weary, had begun to develop a rhythm of defense. Cannon fire from Edgar's walls had become more accurate. Volleys of muskets timed with the approach of Ottoman columns, and boiling liquids poured with deadly precision from parapets. Countermining became increasingly critical. Ottoman engineers had dug tunnels deeper and more stealthily. Dobo's teams detected vibrations, excavated tunnels under cover of darkness, and engaged in terrifying underground combat. The air was thick with dust and smoke, the tunnels constricted, forcing men to fight hand to hand in near pitch black. Despite the risk, the defenders adapted. Gergali Boromissa emerged as a skilled counterminer, leading men with confidence. Civilian volunteers assisted in moving rubble and preparing charges to collapse enemy tunnels. The fortress had become a living organism, each person vital to its survival. Food and gunpowder were dwindling. Supplies had been rationed to near starvation levels, yet the defenders refused to yield. Every day they improvised, making use of every scrap of material available, repairing walls and conserving ammunition. Soldiers rotated duties to avoid exhaustion. Civilians took shifts hauling water and ammunition, and women maintained morale while actively participating in the defense. The sense of unity inside Edgar was as formidable as the stone walls themselves. As November approached, the Ottomans attempted a new tactic. They combined bombardment with concentrated assaults, aiming to breach multiple sections simultaneously. Thousands of janissaries advanced in silence, scaling ladders and engaging defenders at every wall. The defenders met them with deadly volleys, boiling liquids, and improvised defenses. Women and civilians manned positions alongside trained soldiers, throwing stones, pouring scalding liquids, and firing muskets with remarkable precision. The walls became a place of continuous combat, a crucible where courage, skill, and endurance were tested to the limit. Despite exhaustion, the defenders' effectiveness grew. Each assault that failed, each tunnel collapsed, each cannonball absorbed by earthen ramparts strengthened their resolve. Dobo walked the walls nightly, checking positions, speaking to soldiers, civilians, and volunteers. He reminded them why they fought, encouraged them to continue, and led by example. Their resistance was wearing down the attackers, forcing Ali Pasha to reconsider every operation, every strategy. The Ottomans were formidable, but they were not infallible. Edgar's defenders had proven that preparation, courage, and unity could defy even the greatest army in Europe. The days dragged into nights with the same relentless rhythm. The air inside Edgar was thick with smoke, dust, and tension. Soldiers moved like shadows along the ramparts, repairing breaches, hauling ammunition, and standing watch with eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Every thud of a distant cannon or the scrape of enemy ladders against stone made hearts pound. Captain István Dobo walked among them, observing, correcting, and encouraging, a calm anchor in a storm of chaos. Civilian volunteers worked tirelessly alongside trained soldiers. Men carried rubble, repaired walls, and reinforced battlements. Women kept the kitchens running, distributed water, and tended the injured. But they also trained to fight if the walls fell. Children ran messages, carried stones, and did their part in whatever small ways they could. The castle had become a living organism, each heartbeat, vital to its survival. Ava Cisse had grown into her role with fierce determination. Every day she loaded and fired muskets, carried boiling water to the walls, and coached other women in their new roles. Her son Mahali helped as best he could, running errands and supporting her, learning courage under fire. Gurgly Boramisha, the timid clerk, had become a hardened worker, hauling stones and digging trenches, ignoring the blisters and blood on his hands. Even the elderly and children found their place, performing vital tasks that kept the garrison functioning. The Ottomans did not relent. Scouts reported their positions growing closer each day, massive columns of cavalry and infantry stretching toward the horizon. Cannons were brought forward, and the rhythmic pounding of siege preparations echoed across the plain. Every detail of Edgar was under scrutiny. Dobo inspected walls, checked supplies, and listened to reports from every corner. He understood the importance of morale. Soldiers and civilians needed to believe that resistance was possible, even against impossible odds. On September 8th, the final columns of refugees arrived at Edgar. Their journey had been harrowing. Villages burned behind them, smoke filling the skies, families broken and terrified. They came with whatever they could carry, sacks of grain, family heirlooms, and the few belongings they had left. The castle gates opened for them, and Dobo met them personally. He promised safety, but he warned them of the danger to come. Many wept, many prayed, none left. That night the garrison slept little. Dobo walked the walls until the moon was high, observing every detail. He noted the fatigue in the soldiers' movements, the determination in the civilians' eyes, and the readiness of the militia he had drilled tirelessly. Even in the quiet of night, the fortress was alive, every heartbeat connected to the next, preparing for a storm that would soon arrive. The first hint of dawn brought a chill wind and a darkening horizon. Far off in the distance, a wave of steel and silk crested the plains. Cavalry and infantry moved in disciplined formation, the Ottoman army arriving to claim what they assumed was inevitable. Dobo tightened his grip on the railing, telescope in hand, as the magnitude of the threat settled over him. 40,000 soldiers, an army of engineers, cannons, and janissaries poised to lay siege, 2,000 defenders inside the walls, waiting, and then the first cannon fired. A deep boom rolled across the valley, a harbinger of the days to come. Dust rose from the impact, and the walls shuddered under the force. Soldiers ran to repair damage. Women carried water and oil to the ramparts. The garrison braced for the first assault, knowing every day would bring blood and fire. The Siege of Eger had begun in earnest. The first volleys of Ottoman artillery were unlike anything most inside Edgar had ever experienced. The sound was deafening, reverberating through stone and flesh alike. Massive stone balls tore through walls and ramparts, sending dust and debris flying. Work crews scrambled to fill breaches with earth and rubble, replacing stones and reinforcing weakened sections. Cannons fired from every direction, a relentless hammering meant to break both stone and spirit. Inside the castle, defenders moved with precision, muskets cracked, cannons roared in reply, and men and women alike carried out tasks drilled into them for months. Ava Sisi and her team of women kept the boiling water at the ready, pouring it onto anyone who dared approach the walls. Children carried stones and ammunition, their small hands never slowing despite the terror surrounding them. Even the elderly, bandages in hand, moved with calm purpose, attending the wounded and keeping kitchens running under the shadow of death. István Dobo observed from the highest tower, taking in the full scope of the battlefield. He saw formations of cavalry attempting flanking maneuvers, columns of infantry marching to take advantage of breaches, and the ever-approaching janissaries, silent and deadly, who would not be deterred by the carnage already inflicted. He gave orders with a quiet authority, ensuring every position was covered, every weakness addressed, and every man, woman, and child understood their role in the defense. The first major assault came with the rising sun. Drums rolled across the Ottoman lines, announcing the advance. Columns of janissaries moved toward the walls, scaling ladders in hand, their silence more terrifying than any shout. Dobo held his soldiers and civilians in tense readiness. When the attackers were within range, the fortress erupted in controlled chaos. Cannons fired grape shot, muskets unleashed volleys, and boiling water scalded the first waves of soldiers. The ladders toppled, men fell screaming, and yet the disciplined formations pressed forward wave after wave, unyielding. The fight was merciless. Soldiers on both sides grappled atop walls, pushing, stabbing, and swinging weapons in confined spaces, where a single mistake meant death. Civilians trained for this moment moved with surprising efficiency, carrying out their roles with courage that belied their inexperience. Gergali Boramissa, once timid, found himself hauling rubble, reinforcing breaches, and confronting death face to face, his nerves steel. Ava Sisi directed women to counterattacks with boiling water, her voice cutting through smoke and screams, instilling order amid chaos. Hours passed in unbroken conflict. The ground beneath the walls became a graveyard of bodies, but Edgar held. Every assault repelled, every breach repaired, every cannon and musket utilized to its fullest potential. István Dobo walked the walls tirelessly, checking defenses, encouraging fighters, and keeping morale steady. Reports of casualties were grim, but the defenders adapted, learning from each wave, countering each tactic the Ottomans deployed. By nightfall, The first day of full-scale siege had ended. The Ottomans withdrew to regroup, leaving behind hundreds of dead and wounded at the base of Edgar's walls. Inside the fortress, the defenders tended the injured, reinforced defenses, and shared quiet words of encouragement. Dobo met with his officers and civilians, acknowledging their bravery and reinforcing the grim reality. The days to come would be longer, bloodier, and even more relentless. But in that moment, amid the smoke and destruction, there was something else, a sense of unbroken will, a realization that, though vastly outnumbered, the people of Edgar would fight, resist, and refuse to surrender. The walls had stood against the Empire's might, and the defenders had survived. The siege was only beginning, and the story of Edgar, its people, and their captain, Istvan Dobo, was being written in blood and fire. At first light, the fortress trembled under an unrelenting cannonade. Ottoman artillery hammered the eastern and southern walls for 2 straight hours. The ground shook, smoke filled the air. Then the drums began, a relentless heartbeat signaling the advance of thousands of janissaries. Shields overhead, ladders in hand, they surged forward. A human tide meant to overwhelm the defenders. Behind them, provincial infantry armed with pikes and swords pressed in, a living wave of steel and resolve. Dobar's garrison was stretched beyond limit, with roughly 500 soldiers to defend 600 yards of wall. The math was impossible. Civilians stepped in. Women like Eva Sisi led teams that carried boiling cauldrons of water, oil, and animal fat to the walls. When attackers climbed the ladders, they met a scalding death. Screams tore through the morning air. Surviving soldiers were blinded, burned, or sent into shock. The women weren't merely supporting, they were fighting, dying, and killing with fierce courage. Arrows targeted them specifically. One woman was struck while carrying her cauldron, spilling boiling oil that killed 2 nearby companions. Another fell 30 feet to her death after being grabbed by an attacker at the top of the wall. By midday, blood, oil, and debris slicked the eastern wall. The air reeked of gunpowder and burning flesh, yet the walls held. At 2 p.m., Ali Pasha called off the assault. Ottoman casualties numbered over 2,000. Eger had lost 93 defenders and over 100 wounded. Exhausted, burned, and haunted, survivors like Everisi wept not from pain but from the weight of the horror they had endured. Dobar sat silently beside her. Sisi asked, "How much longer can we last?" He replied, "As long as we must." Privately, he knew time was running out. By mid-October, Dobar faced a dire reality. Supplies were nearly gone, ammunition dwindled, walls bore cracks from the bombardment. The Ottomans still outnumbered them 20-1. Victory through brute force was impossible, but survival through cunning remained. Dobar orchestrated a masterstroke of psychological warfare. At night, small groups of soldiers marched past torches repeatedly, simulating reinforcements arriving from the north. Cannons fired volleys at regular intervals, not aimed, just to sound plentiful. The garrison sang loudly, war hymns, folk songs, cries of defiance. The Ottomans watched, misled by the illusion of strength and morale. The ruse worked. Scouts reported reinforcements, steady cannon fire, and unwavering morale. By late October, Ali Pasha faced mounting pressure. Months of siege had cost thousands of men. Winter approached, supply lines strained. The threat of a Hungarian relief force loomed in the north, though delayed by political disputes. From his perspective, he might soon face 2 enemies at once, the fortress and a fresh army. On October 12th, Ali Pasha decided on one final assault. He would commit every available soldier, hoping to secure a decisive victory before winter or before reinforcements could arrive. On the morning of October 17th, 1552, the siege reached its climax. Dawn brought the thunder of Ottoman cannons, all firing at once. The walls shook, dust and smoke filling the air. Sections of the eastern wall collapsed, the southern bastion cracked, and visibility dropped to mere yards. Then the drums began. Approximately 25,000 Ottoman troops surged forward. Janissaries scaled ladders along the eastern wall, provincial infantry attacked the south, and dismounted cavalry advanced on the western gates with battering rams. The defenders met them with every remaining resource. Cannons fired grape shot at close range. Musketeers reloaded and fired despite blistered hands, and women hurled stones, poured boiling liquids, and fought with improvised weapons. In 3 locations, the outer wall was breached. Dobar personally led a counterattack with 50 soldiers into the largest breach. He fought with relentless fury, rallying men by sheer force of will. The breach was cleared temporarily, but at enormous cost. Half of Dabar's men were killed or wounded. By mid-morning, the defense appeared on the brink. Ottoman soldiers occupied the courtyards. The southern bastion teetered. Ammunition was nearly gone. Casualties mounted, yet the defenders did not break. Hour after hour they held their ground. Exhaustion gripped the attackers. The Janissaries, disciplined though they were, faltered. Their numbers became liabilities, as every step forward cost dozens of lives. By noon, Ali Pasha ordered a temporary withdrawal to regroup. The defenders used the pause to rebuild barricades from corpses, rubble, and debris. 2 hours later, the Ottomans attacked again, but their assault was disorganized, worn down, and disoriented. Their charges were repulsed. By sunset, Ali Pasha called off the assault entirely. The defenders of Eger stood among the dead and dying, too exhausted to cheer, too numb to celebrate. Their fortress, shattered and scarred, had survived the impossible. The night after the final assault was eerily silent. No bombardments, no drums, no shouts, just quiet. The survivors counted their losses. Of the original 800 soldiers, fewer than 300 remained combat effective. Over 200 civilians had been killed. Wounded filled every available space. The castle a ruin of collapsed walls, burned buildings, and debris-strewn courtyards. By October 18th, Ottoman activity suggested a retreat. Wagons and troops formed marching columns. On the 19th, lookouts confirmed the unimaginable. The Ottoman army had withdrawn. The siege was over. Eger had held. Casualties were staggering. Ottoman losses numbered between 8,000 and 10,000 men, including elite janissaries, artillerymen, and engineers. For the fortress, roughly 1/3 of its population had died, soldiers and civilians alike. Mass graves were dug and Christian burial rites performed over hundreds of bodies at once. The psychological toll was severe. Survivors endured trauma akin to modern PTSD, intrusive memories, emotional numbness, nightmares, and hypervigilance. Women and civilians, many with no prior combat experience, bore the brunt of the siege alongside the soldiers. Yet despite this, the defense achieved something extraordinary. Eger controlled a critical pass through the northern highlands. Its survival stopped the Ottoman advance, disrupted Sultan Suleiman's expansion plans, and gave Europe hope. News of Eger's victory spread across the continent, from Vienna to Rome, creating a surge of morale among Christian states. István Dobar emerged as a hero, though he deflected credit to his soldiers and civilian defenders. Women like Eva Sisi became symbols of resistance. Chroniclers like Gurgi Boramisa documented the siege in detail, emphasizing the bravery and sacrifice of ordinary people who refused to surrender. Eger's defense reshaped military thinking. Small, well-led forces could withstand vastly superior armies if morale, terrain, preparation, and leadership were leveraged effectively. The siege became a case study in combining strategy, civilian involvement, and psychological warfare to achieve the impossible. Even centuries later, Eger Castle stands as a monument to courage. The story reminds us that history is shaped not only by kings and generals, but by ordinary people who rise to extraordinary challenges. The Siege of Eger was more than a military engagement. It became a symbol of human resilience. Ordinary people, farmers, craftsmen, women, and even children had stood against one of the most powerful empires on earth. They fought not for glory, but because surrender would have meant the destruction of their homes and way of life. Istvan Dubar, competent and steadfast, exemplified leadership in crisis. He prepared his garrison, communicated clearly, and trusted civilians to rise to the occasion. That trust was rewarded, proving that leadership is not about charisma alone, it's about preparation, confidence, and believing in the people under your command. Eger also demonstrates the limits of sheer military power. The Ottomans had numbers, technology, experience, and resources. Yet, despite continuous bombardment, repeated assaults, and elite troops, they could not break the defenders' will. Morale, terrain, and human determination ultimately dictated the outcome. The fortress controlled a critical route through the Hungarian highlands, preventing Ottoman expansion into Upper Hungary's mining towns and providing vital time for Habsburg forces. Eger's successful defense inspired hope across Europe, proving that resistance was possible and that even overwhelming odds could be overcome with strategy, courage, and perseverance. The story of Eger was recorded in chronicles, novels, and histories. Ava Sisi and the women defenders became icons, remembered as the fire women of Eger. Gurgi Boramus's eyewitness accounts preserved the events for posterity, emphasizing that survival came at a profound cost, but also that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary feats. Military thinkers studied Eger for generations. The integration of civilians, psychological deception, countermining operations, and effective use of terrain became textbook examples of siege defense. Leaders learned that strategy, preparation, and morale often outweighed sheer numbers. Eger Castle today is a national monument, drawing visitors who walk its restored walls and reflect on the courage it took to hold them. The Ottoman Empire continued to pose threats for centuries, but Eger marked a turning point, proof that empires were not invincible and that determination could change history. The siege reminds us that history is made by those who choose to stand. Even when logic says defeat is inevitable, ordinary people can shape the course of events through courage, preparation, and refusal to surrender. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Eger's siege, like, subscribe, and share this video. Let us know in the comments what would you have done if you were on those walls facing impossible odds. The defenders of Eger made their choice. Their legacy is ours to remember.